The screams cut through the evening air like a blade through silk, piercing even the thunderous approach of the 8:15 freight train. Cormac O'Sullivan's massive frame froze mid-stride as he herded his cattle back from the pasture, his weathered hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles turned white. At 6'8" and built like a mountain, he'd heard plenty of sounds that would make lesser men flee wildcats, stampeding bulls, men dying in range wars, but this cry held something different, something that made his blood run cold. Woman's voice rose again, desperate and raw, echoing from the direction of the railway tracks that cut through his sprawling ranch like a steel scar. Without hesitation, Cormac spurred his stallion toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. The train's whistle shrieked in the distance, maybe 2 miles out but closing fast. Steam billowed against the darkening sky like the breath of some iron beast hungry for sacrifice. As he crested the hill overlooking the tracks, Cormac's world tilted sideways. There, bound to the rails with rough hemp rope, lay a young woman in a torn calico dress, her auburn hair spread like spilled wine across the steel. In her arms she clutched a bundle of baby, barely weeks old by the look of it, its tiny fists waving in the cooling air. The woman's green eyes found his across the distance, and in them he saw not just terror, but fierce maternal protection that blazed brighter than the approaching locomotive's headlamp. "Help us!" she cried, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Please, dear God, help my baby." Cormac vaulted from his horse before it fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with enough force to send tremors through the earth. The train's rumble grew stronger, the rails beginning to sing with vibration. He had maybe 3 minutes, maybe less. His massive hands worked frantically at the knots, but they were tied by someone who knew their business, tight, complex, designed to hold fast against struggle. "Who did this to you?" he growled, pulling a knife from his belt and sawing at the ropes. "My husband," she gasped, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Corvin Blackthorne, he found out the baby isn't his. Said he'd rather see us dead than disgraced." The name hit Cormac like a physical blow. Blackthorne, the most powerful rancher in 3 counties. A man who owned judges, sheriffs, and politicians like other men own cattle. A man who'd tried to buy Cormac's land for years, and when refused, had made life hell for the Irish giant. Who dared stand against him? The locomotive's whistle screamed again, closer now. Cormac could see the engineer's lantern swinging frantically. The man had spotted them but couldn't stop in time. The knife blade finally parted the last strand of rope just as the woman Evangeline, she gasped, her name went limp with relief. "Hold tight to that baby," Cormac commanded, scooping her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He dove clear of the tracks just as the freight train thundered past, its wind whipping their hair and clothes, the engineer's shouts lost in the mechanical roar. In the sudden quiet that followed, with only the fading clatter of wheels on rails and the soft crying of the infant, Cormac looked down at the woman in his arms and felt something shift in his chest, something he'd thought died with his wife. 5 years ago, Cormac carried Evangeline and her child to his ranch house, a sturdy log structure that stood like a fortress against the rolling hills. Inside, lamplight flickered across rough-hewn walls lined with books, an unusual sight in cattle country, but Cormac had always been more than just brawn and bluster. He'd built his spread with his hands and his mind, and both had served him well against men like Corvin Blackthorne. "Easy now," he murmured, settling Evangeline into the leather chair by the fireplace. Her face was pale as morning frost, and her hands trembled as she adjusted the baby's swaddling. "You're safe here. Blackthorne won't find you." Evangeline's laugh held no humor. "You don't know him like I do. Corvin doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. He'll come for us, and he'll destroy anyone who helps us." Cormac knelt beside her chair, his calloused hands gentle as he examined the rope burns on her wrists. Let him come. I've been waiting for that snake to show his true colors for years." As he tended her wounds with practiced care, he doctored enough injured animals to know his way around hurts. Evangeline studied his face. The giant rancher had kind eyes the color of storm clouds, and silver threading through his dark hair spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. There was strength in every line of him, but also a gentleness that made her heart flutter despite everything she'd endured. "Why are you helping us?" she whispered. "You could have left us there, avoided all this trouble." Cormac's hand stilled on the bandage he was wrapping. "My Moira always said a man's character isn't measured by what he does when it's easy, but what he does when it's hard." His voice caught slightly on his dead wife's name. "Besides, I've tangled with Blackthorn before. He burned out 3 of my neighbors who wouldn't sell to him, ran cattle through my fields, poisoned my water holes. Time someone stood up to him proper." The baby began to fuss, and Evangeline quickly unlaced her bodice to nurse him. Cormac turned away respectfully, busying himself with stoking the fire, but not before noticing how her auburn hair caught the lamplight like autumn leaves, how her green eyes held depths he wanted to explore. "What's his name?" Cormac asked quietly, his back still turned. "Finnegan," Evangeline said, and the name made Cormac's shoulders stiffen. It was an Irish name, like his own, after his real father. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Slowly, Cormac turned back to face her, and she met his gaze without shame. Finn O'Malley was a good man, a railroad worker. He died in a tunnel collapse before he knew about the baby. Her voice grew stronger. "Corvin married me for my family's land, but when Finnegan was born with Finn's red hair and blue eyes instead of Corvin's black ones, he knew the truth." Cormac nodded, understanding flooding through him. In this hard country, a woman alone with a child had few options, and fewer still if powerful men wanted her gone. You did what you had to do to survive. No shame in that. Outside, wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound made Evangeline shiver and pull her baby closer. Cormac saw her fear and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Stay," he said simply. "Stay as long as you need to. Both of you." Tears welled in Evangeline's eyes. "I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." His voice held the same certainty he'd used to build his ranch from nothing. "Tomorrow I'll ride into town, see what the law has to say about attempted murder. Blackthorn may own half the county, but he doesn't own all of it. Not yet." As if summoned by the mention of his name, hoofbeats thundered in the distance, growing closer. Cormac moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Through the darkness he could see torches approaching, too many for a friendly visit. "They found us," Evangeline breathed, terror creeping back into her voice. Cormac's jaw set like granite. "Then they'll find more than they bargained for." The torchlight flickered against the darkness like malevolent stars as Corvin Blackthorn's men surrounded the ranch house. From the window, Cormac counted at least a dozen riders, all armed, all looking eager for violence. At their head sat Blackthorn himself, a lean man with dead black eyes and the kind of smile that promised suffering. "O'Sullivan." Blackthorn's voice carried easily across the yard. "Send out my wife and the bastard child, and we'll leave you in peace." Cormac stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled in his arms, every inch of his imposing frame radiating controlled danger. "She's not your wife anymore, Blackthorn. Not after what you tried to do." Blackthorn's laugh was like breaking glass. Man has rights over his property, Irish. You of all people should understand that, being so protective of your own land." "A woman isn't property," Cormac replied, his voice carrying deadly quiet across the night air. "And attempted murder tends to void marriage vows in my book." Behind him, Evangeline appeared in the doorway, baby Finnegan in her arms. Despite her fear, she stood straight and proud, her chin lifted in defiance. "I'll never go back to you, Corvin. Never." Several of Blackthorn's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They'd signed on to intimidate homesteaders and rustle cattle, not to murder women and infants. But their leader showed no such hesitation. "Then you'll both die." "Here," Blackthorn snarled. "And the Irish giant with you. Boys, burn them out." That's when the night exploded into chaos. Cormac's rifle spoke first, dropping the man reaching for a torch. But what happened next surprised everyone. Shots rang out from the hills surrounding the ranch, and 3 more of Blackthorn's riders toppled from their horses. "What in hell?" Blackthorn spun in his saddle, trying to identify the new threat. From the darkness came voices. Cormac recognized his neighbors, men whose land Blackthorn had tried to steal, whose livelihoods he'd threatened. They'd seen the torches from miles away and come running, ready to make their stand. "Seems you're outnumbered, Blackthorn," called Tom Weatherby, emerging from behind the barn with a shotgun. Behind him came the Kowalski brothers, old Ben Martinez, and half a dozen other ranchers who'd had enough of Blackthorn's tyranny. The tide had turned, but Blackthorn wasn't finished. His hand moved toward his pistol, and Cormac saw murder in the man's eyes, not for him, but for Evangeline. In that moment, everything slowed. Cormac could see Blackthorn's gun clearing. Leather could see the hatred twisted across his face as he aimed not at the men who threatened him, but at the woman who dared defy him. Time compressed to a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Cormac made his choice. He threw himself sideways, his massive body shielding Evangeline and the baby as Blackthorn's gun fired. The bullet meant for her tore through his shoulder instead, spinning him around but not dropping him. The answering volley from the surrounding ranchers was immediate and final. Corvin Blackthorn pitched backward from his horse. His reign of terror ended in the dust of Cormac's yard. The remaining hired guns, seeing their boss dead and themselves outnumbered by angry neighbors, raised their hands in surrender. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Evangeline knelt beside Cormac where he'd fallen, her hands pressing against his wounded shoulder to stem the bleeding. "You fool," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You beautiful, brave fool." Cormac managed a pained smile. "Couldn't let him hurt you," he said through gritted teeth. "Either of you." As the neighbors secured the surviving gunman and someone rode for the doctor in town, Evangeline held Cormac's head in her lap, baby Finnegan sleeping peacefully in her other arm. In the lamplight streaming from the open door, she looked down at the man who'd risked everything for her, a stranger, a woman with another man's child, a woman who could only bring him trouble. "Why?" she asked softly, brushing silver-streaked hair from his forehead. "Why did you do all this for us?" Cormac's storm-gray eyes found hers and held them. Despite the pain, despite the blood, his voice was steady and sure. "Because from the moment I pulled you off those tracks, you and that boy became mine to protect. Not as property," he added quickly, remembering Blackthorn's words, "but as family, if you'll have us." The words hung in the cool night air like a promise, like a prayer. And as Evangeline looked down at this gentle giant who'd given her back her life and her freedom, she felt something bloom in her chest that she'd thought died with Finn O'Malley hope, and maybe something even stronger. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a beloved book. Cormac's shoulder mended slowly but surely under Evangeline's careful tending, and with each day, the distance between them seemed to shrink. She proved herself far more than just a woman in need of rescue. She could cook meals that made his hired hands weep with joy, doctor sick cattle with an intuitive touch, and argue politics and philosophy late into the evening with a sharp wit that delighted him. "You're far too educated for a rancher's wife," Cormac teased one evening as they sat on the porch, baby Finnegan sleeping contentedly in a cradle he'd carved from oak. The late summer air carried the scent of hay and wildflowers, and fireflies danced like fallen stars across the pastures. Evangeline looked up from the book. She'd been reading one of his volumes of Shakespeare, borrowed from his surprisingly extensive library. "And you're far too well read for a cattle baron," she countered, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Where does a giant Irish rancher learn to quote Yeats and argue theology?" "Seminary," Cormac admitted, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Before I came to America, before I met Moira, thought I had a calling to the priesthood until I realized my calling was for something earthier land, cattle, and eventually a copper-haired lass who could make me laugh again." The admission hung between them, loaded with possibility. Evangeline set down her book and moved to the porch rail, looking out over the land that stretched endlessly under the star-scattered sky. "Cormac, I need to tell you something. About Finn, about Finnegan's father." Cormac's stomach clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "You don't owe me explanations about your past, Evangeline." "But I do." She turned to face him, moonlight silvering her hair. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and you deserve the whole truth." The words hit him like lightning, illuminating corners of his heart he'd kept shuttered since Moira's death. He started to speak, but she held up a hand. "Finn O'Malley wasn't just a railroad worker," she continued. "He was my first love, my childhood sweetheart. We were going to be married, but my father forbade it, said I was too good for an Irish laborer. When Finn died in that tunnel collapse, I thought I'd lost my only chance at real love. Then Corvin came calling with his money and his promises, and my father saw dollar signs." Cormac rose from his chair, his wounded shoulder protesting the movement. "Evangeline, I married Corvin for security, for my family's sake. But I never loved him, never gave him what I gave Finn." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Until now, until you." The space between them seemed to pulse with unspoken longing. Cormac reached out slowly, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I thought my heart died with Moira," he admitted. "Thought I was done with love, with hope. But you and that baby, you've brought something back to life in me." When their lips met, it was with the tenderness of two souls who had both known loss and were brave enough to risk love again. The kiss tasted of possibility, of healing, of futures neither had dared dream. They were interrupted by a soft cry from baby Finnegan's cradle. Evangeline moved to lift the infant, but Cormac was there first, his massive hands gentle as he gathered the child against his chest. Finnegan's tiny fist curled around Cormac's finger, and the big man's face transformed with wonder. "He's got a grip like a horseman already," Cormac murmured, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Won't be long before he's riding the range, helping with the cattle. You really mean it, don't you?" Evangeline asked, watching this tender giant hold her son like he was made of spun glass. "About us being family." Cormac met her gaze over the baby's red-gold hair. "Evangeline Murphy, because you're not a blackthorn anymore, not in any way that matters, I'm asking you to be my wife. Not for convenience, not for protection, but because I love you. Both of you." The proposal hung in the night air like music, like prayer. And as Evangeline looked at this man who had saved their lives, who held her son with such careful love, who had given her back her faith in goodness, she knew her answer before the words left her lips. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Cormac O'Sullivan, 1,000 times yes." The wedding took place on a golden October morning in the valley where Cormac's cattle grazed, with the entire community gathered to witness what many called the miracle match of the century. Father Mackenzie, the traveling priest who served the scattered Catholic families of the territory, had ridden in specially for the occasion, his eyes twinkling with delight at officiating the union of the giant Irishman and the brave woman he'd rescued. Evangeline wore a dress of cream-colored silk that the town's women had sewn together from their finest materials, a wedding gift that brought tears to her eyes. Her auburn hair was crowned with wildflowers that Cormac had picked himself at dawn, and in her arms she carried baby Finnegan, now 4 months old and gurgling happily at all the attention. Cormac stood waiting at the makeshift altar, his broad shoulders filling his Sunday suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When he saw Evangeline walking toward him through the meadow grass, flanked by the Kowalski brothers who had volunteered to give her away, his breath caught in his throat. She looked like something from a fairy tale, too beautiful to be real. Too good to be his, but she was real and she was his. And when she reached his side and placed her small hand in his massive one, Cormac felt like he could move mountains. "Dearly beloved," Father Mackenzie began, his Irish brogue carrying across the valley, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these good people to witness the joining of Cormac Michael O'Sullivan and Evangeline Rose Murphy in holy matrimony." Ceremony was simple but profound, their vows spoken with voices that shook with emotion. When Cormac promised to love and protect not just Evangeline but her son, to raise Finnegan as his own flesh and blood, there wasn't a dry eye among the witnesses. And when Evangeline promised to stand by Cormac through whatever storms might come, to build their life together on this land they both loved, even the hardest cowboys found themselves dabbing at their eyes. The celebration that followed lasted until the stars came out. The Kowalski brothers had brought their fiddles, old Ben Martinez contributed his guitar, and soon the valley rang with music and laughter. Couples danced in the grass while children ran between the tables laden with food that the community had contributed: roasted beef from Cormac's herd, corn from the Weatherby farm, pies and cakes from every kitchen in 50 miles. But the moment that would live forever in everyone's memory came when Cormac, emboldened by happiness and perhaps a bit of the Irish whiskey that Tom Weatherby had brought, stood up to make a toast. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily across the gathering, "5 months ago, I was a man alone, convinced that love was behind me, that my best days were done. Then I heard screams near the railway tracks, and my life changed forever." He looked down at Evangeline, who sat beside him with Finnegan sleeping in her lap, and his voice grew tender. "This woman and her son didn't just save my soul from loneliness, they reminded me what we're all fighting for out here. Not just land, not just cattle, but the chance to build something good, something lasting, something worth passing on to the next generation." He raised his glass higher, and every adult in the gathering followed suit. "To Evangeline, who showed me that courage comes in many forms. To baby Finnegan, who will grow up knowing what it means to be loved unconditionally. And to all of you, who prove that when good people stand together, evil cannot prevail." The cheer that went up could have been heard in the next county. But as the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Cormac and Evangeline found themselves alone on their porch again, just as they had been on so many evenings during their courtship. "No regrets?" Cormac asked quietly, his arm around his new wife as they watched the last of the lanterns disappear down the valley road. Evangeline snuggled closer to his warmth, baby Finnegan peaceful in her arms. "Only one," she said, and Cormac's heart clenched. For a moment before she continued with a smile in her voice, "I regret that it took so long to find you." In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the night, the same sound that had once meant terror and death but now seemed to be singing a lullaby of new beginnings. And as they sat there together, the giant rancher and his bride, with their child sleeping peacefully between them, it seemed like the whole valley was holding its breath in contentment, as if even the land itself approved of this union born from courage and sealed with love. 2 years flowed by like a river finding its course, each season bringing new joys and challenges to the O'Sullivan Ranch. Baby Finnegan grew from a gurgling infant into a sturdy toddler with his mother's green eyes and hair the color of autumn sunset. His first word wasn't mama or dada, but horses, which he pronounced hosses while pointing excitedly at the pasture where Cormac's stallions grazed. Cormac proved to be the father Finnegan's birth father never had the chance to become. He carved wooden horses for the boy to play with, taught him to whistle through grass blades, and carried him on his shoulders while checking the cattle. The sight of the gentle giant with the red-haired toddler perched on his broad back became as familiar around the valley as sunrise itself. "He's going to be tall like his da," said Elena Kowalski one afternoon as she visited Evangeline, watching Finnegan toddle after Cormac with determined steps. The women sat on the porch shelling peas while their men discussed cattle prices in the yard. "His da," Evangeline repeated softly, and the words filled her with warmth. Finnegan had never known any father, but Cormac would never remember the man who tried to tie them both to railroad tracks. In every way that mattered, Cormac O'Sullivan was Finnegan's father, and the love between them proved that blood wasn't the only thing that made a family. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Evangeline's sharp mind for business complemented Cormac's instinct for ranching, and together they expanded their operation to include the finest horses in 3 counties. Her way with animals proved almost mystical. She could calm a wild stallion with gentle words and patient hands, and her herb garden became legendary for healing both livestock and people. But it was the evening conversations that both treasured most. After Finnegan was tucked into the cradle that had expanded into a proper child's bed carved with Celtic knots, Cormac and Evangeline would sit by the fire sharing their days, their dreams, their plans for the future. "I've been thinking," Evangeline said one autumn evening as maple leaves danced past their windows, "about expanding the house. Maybe adding another room or 2. Cormac looked up from the harness he was mending, his eyes hopeful. "Another room? Planning on taking in boarders?" Evangeline's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly, and Cormac's understanding dawned like sunrise. The harness dropped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "Evangeline," he breathed, wonder and joy warring in his voice, "are you?" "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when I went for supplies," she said, tears of happiness sparkling in her green eyes. "We're going to have a baby, Cormac." Our baby. The gentle giant who had faced down armed men and wild stallions without flinching was reduced to wordless joy. He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept Evangeline into his arms, spinning her gently around the parlor while she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. "When?" he asked, setting her down carefully as if she were made of precious porcelain. "Early spring, the doctor thinks, April or May." Cormac's face transformed with a smile that seemed to light the entire room. "A spring baby." Moira always said spring babies brought luck to the land. The mention of his first wife might have brought sadness once, but now Evangeline only smiled. She'd learned to treasure the stories Cormac told about Moira, understanding. That love didn't diminish by being shared, but rather multiplied. Her own memories of Finn O'Malley had softened from grief to gratitude, and she knew that somehow, somewhere, both of their lost loves were smiling at the happiness they'd found together. That night, as they lay in their marriage bed with Evangeline's head on Cormac's shoulder and his large hand resting protectively over her belly, they talked in whispers about names and cribs and the future they were building together. "Boy or girl?" Cormac asked softly. "Does it matter?" "Not a whit. Long as it's healthy and has your spirit and your mother's heart." "And your strength and your father's hands," Evangeline added, intertwining their fingers. Outside, the wind sang through the trees, and in the next room, Finnegan slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams come to happy children who know they are loved without question. The ranch house that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with contentment, and the valley itself seemed to settle into satisfaction, as if the very land approved of the love that had taken root there. As they drifted toward sleep, Cormac pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Evangeline's head and whispered the words that had become his nightly prayer. "Thank you, God, for screams that led me to salvation." May arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the valley, and with it came Moira Evangeline O'Sullivan, named for the two women who had shaped Cormac's capacity for love. The birth was attended by Elena Kowalski and Dr. Patterson from town, while Cormac paced the porch like a caged bear until the first cry of his daughter pierced the morning air. When he was finally allowed into the bedroom, the sight that greeted him nearly brought the giant to his knees. Evangeline, tired but radiant, held a tiny bundle with wisps of dark hair and eyes that would surely be storm gray like her father's. Little Finnegan, now almost 3, stood on tiptoe beside the bed, trying to see his new sister. "She's so small, Mama," he whispered in his piping voice. "Is she gonna grow big like Day?" "She'll grow just as big as she's meant to be," Evangeline assured him, making room on the bed for Cormac to sit beside them. "And you're going to be the best big brother in all of Colorado." Cormac reached out with one massive finger to stroke his daughter's tiny cheek, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. "She's perfect," he breathed. "Absolutely perfect." The months that followed brought a contentment so deep it seemed to seep into the very foundation of their lives. Baby Moira proved to have her father's gentle strength and her mother's fierce spirit, while Finnegan appointed himself her chief protector, bringing her flowers from the meadow and singing the Irish lullabies Cormac had taught him. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming known throughout the territory not just for its fine cattle and horses, but for the hospitality and kindness of its owners. Travelers were always welcome at the O'Sullivan table, and more than one down-on-his-luck drifter found steady work and a chance at a new life on their spread. One evening in late autumn, as the family sat around their dinner table, Cormac carving roast beef, Evangeline nursing baby Moira, and 4-year-old Finnegan chattering about the colt he'd helped birth that morning, a knock came at the door. Cormac opened it to find a young woman, travel-worn and clearly pregnant, with fear in her dark eyes and desperation in the set of her shoulders. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard in town that you help people. My husband, he's not a good man. He'll kill me and my baby if he finds us." Cormac and Evangeline exchanged a look of complete understanding. Without hesitation, Evangeline rose from the table, baby Moira still in her arms. "Come in, dear," she said warmly, guiding the frightened woman to a chair by the fire. "You're safe now. What's your name?" "Rosalind," the woman whispered, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "Rosalind Chandler." As Evangeline bustled about getting food and preparing a room for their unexpected guest, Cormac knelt beside Rosalind's chair. "We'll help you," he said simply. "Whatever you need, however long it takes. You have my word." Later that night, after Rosalind had been settled in the guest room and the children were asleep, Cormac and Evangeline sat on their porch in comfortable silence, watching stars wheel overhead. "Feels like we've come full circle," Evangeline mused, her head on Cormac's shoulder. "From you rescuing us to us rescuing others." Cormac's arm tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to her hair that still smelled of wildflowers and home. "Maybe that's what love really is," he said thoughtfully. "Not just finding happiness for yourself, but using that happiness to help others find theirs." A train whistle echoed across the valley, the same sound that had once brought terror but now served as a nightly reminder of how far they'd come. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in the pastures, and from inside the house came the soft breathing of sleeping children and the gentle rustle of Rosalind settling into safety. "Do you ever wonder," Evangeline asked softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't heard my screams that night?" Cormac considered the question seriously, as he did all of her queries. "I think," he said finally, "that we would have found each other eventually. Love like ours doesn't come from chance, Evangeline. It comes from two souls meant to fit together finally finding their way home." The truth of those words settled over them like a blessing. They had built something here in this valley that would outlast them both, not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of love conquering fear, of strength protecting gentleness, of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things for those who needed help. God, as they rose to go inside, Evangeline paused at the door and looked back over the land that had become their kingdom, their sanctuary, their gift to the future. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, to fate, to whatever force had brought them together on that terrible and wonderful evening by the railway tracks. And somewhere in the darkness, as if the valley itself were listening, a gentle breeze stirred the wildflowers, carrying with it the promise of spring, of new beginnings, and of love stories yet to be written in this place where giants and angels dwelt in perfect harmony.